Damian McBride is here now. Ed Balls called what you did today despicable. What's your adjective?
I agree with him.
You think what you were doing was despicable?
In the aspects that have been described in the extracts that have appeared so far in the Daily Mail.
The extracts you describe yourself?
Yeah. And I describe myself in far worse terms than anyone has at this conference so far in that book.
So this is a sort of confessional, is it?
Well, it's me saying this is how I behaved. It's not all of what I did in that job, but that was maybe 5 or 10% of what I did. What I describe as skullduggery, and yes, I'm admitting to that.
You made it quite clear in that piece of tape just there that you would like to see Labour return to government. Is that correct?
Well, I'm still a Labour supporter. Yeah.
Right. Can you tell us precisely how it helps the Labour Party to serialise your memoirs in the Daily Mail on the eve of conference?
It doesn't help, Jeremy. But there's no good time to publish a book like this.
There's a bad time, and you've chosen it deliberately.
Well, I was offered much more money. I was offered a much more lucrative contract
How much were you
to publish
offered?
this book in April 2015. I was told that whatever I was offered by anyone else, I could double that to publish it in April 2015 to do maximum damage to the Labour Party. I chose not to do that because I wanted to publish a book at some stage, and I thought, well, better to do it now as long as possible before the general election.
So how many pieces of silver did they give you for this one?
Well, I've been well paid for it. I mean, so after the publisher keeps their share...
Over 100,000?
Yeah, and after the publisher keeps their share and the taxman keeps his, then, I will do very well out of this book.
You say that Gordon Brown wasn't in on the intricacies of what you were doing when you were rubbishing members of the Cabinet and the like. But there was some sort of unspoken understanding between the two of you. What did he think you were doing?
I don't think he knew what I was doing a lot of the time.
He did know?
No, I don't think he knew what I was doing a lot of the time. I operated quite a lot in the shadows. I spent a lot of time just in pubs with different journalists and doing that kind of operation. And I think what Gordon always knew that he got from me was media intelligence that was unparalleled and sort of access to different bits of the media that other politicians couldn't reach. What? And frankly, he never asked the question, how do you pull this off? Because he just assumed that this was based on my personal relationships with journalists.
Where did he think all the stories in the newspapers came from?
Well, which ones?
The stories about, for example, the stories against, I don't know, John Reed, Charles Clarke, for example.
Well, let's take the example of the Charles Clarke story. So I've admitted in this book that I orchestrated a briefing war between Charles Clarke and his antisocial behaviour advisor, Louise Casey. Now, even Charles Clarke and Louise Casey, until I published this book, had no idea that I was responsible for that. Charles Clarke's advisors would pour their hearts out to me about Louise Casey doing this stuff. So if they didn't realise, who were as close to it as anyone could have been, how was Gordon Brown at several steps removed supposed to have worked out, well, those stories must be coming from my special advisor?
Not only was this a man who was described by other insiders in Downing Street as psychologically flawed, he was also away with the fairies half the time, was he?
Well, not at all. I mean, but he had bigger and better things to be getting on with than worrying about where a particular story appeared on the front of the Sunday Times from. And frankly, it wasn't for Gordon Brown to sort of think, well, he didn't understand how I operated. That's the truth of it. I regarded myself as being responsible for giving him an unparalleled relationship with Sunday newspapers so that they didn't attack him.
Did Ed Balls and Ed Miliband know what you were up to?
No, even less than Gordon would have done, because they didn't work with me on a day-to-day basis in the way that I did with Gordon. I spent half my life going around the country with Gordon, on the phone to journalists while I was with him, whereas I didn't really do that with Ed Balls or Ed Miliband.
You describe in some detail in the extracts we've seen how the then Prime Minister Gordon Brown exploded periodically. Did you come to the conclusion he was psychologically flawed?
No. I thought he was a great man who...
With a fearsome temper.
Well, but like a lot of us, he had a fearsome temper, but he was also a hugely tender man. I mean, this hasn't necessarily come out in the extracts that have been seen today, but there was a tenderness about him and a care about him and concern for his staff that you don't really see about in memoirs, and hopefully people will see that from the book that I've written.
But this stuff that you were putting into the newspapers reflects on him, doesn't it?
Ultimately, it does, because I was employed by him. And I think
he protected you.
Right, but he knew that in April 2009, when I was dismissed for doing arguably far worse things than I've admitted to doing in this book. And he was deeply ashamed of that, and deeply ashamed that that was done by someone working in his employment.
How do you think politics gets to the state where people like you are able to do what you did?
Because people don't tell the truth, and that's what I've tried to do in this book. If people aren't honest about how politics really operates, then you can't clean it up. I mean, the great thing about this week, as much as Labour people will feel that, this has been disastrous for them, as Allegra has said, is that every single member of the Shadow Cabinet has now made a commitment and a vow that they will never do anonymous briefing. Well, we've never had that before. Didn't have that under the Conservative opposition. We've never had it under a previous Labour government, and hopefully that will be a good thing, and they will be held to that standard. Now, that's a side effect. I'm not saying that I was trying to produce that effect, but nevertheless, that's the result.
Can politics be done like that nowadays?
Well, it should be. It should be.
Can it be?
But that's what
you concluded inside Number 10 it couldn't be done like that.
But I was wrong. I was wrong, and I shouldn't have operated that way. From my point of view, I don't want to blame the system, but the longer I stayed in that system, the worse my behaviour became. And
are you sorry?
Yeah, deeply, and ashamed.
To the people you hurt, would you like to apologise to them?
Well, I do in the book, and I do feel ashamed. I do feel sorry to those individuals whose careers I affected, and even more so to the sort of, if you like, the innocent bystanders that were caught in the way, special advisors that worked for them that ended up losing their jobs as a result of people being shuffled out of the government, people that were mentioned in the context of, these sort of sleazy stories who did nothing to deserve to be there, were not even sort of members of any political party, and of course I feel ashamed of that.
Have you sought absolution?
Well, I think those sort of religious things are private, and I don't do that. But what I do regard this book as is about coming clean, admitting the truth, being honest. I mean, I had people that I wouldn't regard as friends of mine in the Labour Party, senior figures in the Labour Party, say if I tried to write a book and wasn't honest about everything I'd done, then they would destroy my credibility. And so I took the view, well,
and you've
I'll take them at
confessed
their word, to be honest.
in this book to some things which may be criminal offences, the Misuse of Computers Act, for example.
I haven't, I'm sure, Jeremy, because I was always very careful about this during the years, that I wasn't committing any criminal offences. For example, I go at great lengths to explain how I would not leak classified documents, and I would take pains to avoid doing that.
You're not worried about a police investigation?
I'd be happy to talk to the police if they wanted an explanation